Hi, this is Scott Miller. Welcome to my Top Performance blog. I have the honor and privilege today of speaking with Dr. Kim Penberthy, who is the Charles F. Carlson Chair in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at University of Virginia, UVA. Go UVA. Thanks, Kim, for being willing to talk with me today.
Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And I do want to just say it is Chester F. Carlson.
What did I say, Charles?
I think so. And I make sure this wonderful gentleman is named correctly.
And who was he anyway?
So my understanding is that he was the man who developed Xerox. We're all familiar with the copier, and he made a lot of money, as you can imagine. He's no longer with us. However, he did leave money to the University of Virginia, to my division in particular. So shout out to him and his family.
And he's made all of these positions possible with that funding.
A lot of our funding is from that endowment. Yeah.
And that division, it's an interesting name, and I'm going to be completely open and honest because I had never heard about it. And we had done a pretty deep dive when we started to research the subject we're here to talk about today. It's called the DOPS Center, or the Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA. What is that?
You're right. It is a division in our Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences. Interestingly, even though many people have not heard of it, it has been around for over 50 years. So it's been here doing our work very quietly. And the division is, I'll have to say, a bit of a misnomer. People don't really understand what we mean by perceptual studies. It seems a little odd. The division has been comprised consistently of, people in our Department of Psychiatry, psychiatrists, psychologists. We also have people that are engineers and philosophers. And so a pretty broad range of people affiliated with it. And the research we do is really on consciousness, different states of consciousness, and specifically looking at this idea of survival, the survival of consciousness after the death of the physical body, and all that that implies. So really looking at sort of alternative ways of explaining our world and our experience as humans. And we have been, toiling away at this for a while. Some of it sometimes intentionally under the radar. So that may be part of why you haven't seen us splashed across the headlines.
And why would you be working under the radar? Are you involved in secret government experiments about remote viewing, or what is this?
No. So I think some of it comes from the more distant past. When this started, some of this information, this research was perhaps not as well known or understood. So the person who established this was our former chair. He's now passed away, unfortunately, but he developed Ian Stevenson was his name, Dr. Stevenson. He was a child psychiatrist. He was the chair of the Department of Psychiatry and really became interested in children who remember and report past lives. So his line of work was in that area. And most of his work and data that he collected, very scientific, he was a very rigorous scientist. Most of his work was collected abroad. So in cultures, in countries where this is fairly well known and accepted as part of their belief system. So places like India. And he continued that work until he died. There have been other researchers that sprung out of this, and we now have researchers, Dr. Bruce Grayson doing research on near-death experiences, Dr. Jim Tucker, who's also a child psychiatrist, continuing the work on children who remember past lives. And I joined really focusing on research in altered states of consciousness that are achieved through contemplative practices like meditation, yoga. That was my initial beginning of really looking at the fact that not all of us are going to have a near-death experience. Not all of us remember past lives. What we know from those experiences is they seem to be quite beneficial. for the people who have them, and we can talk about that
Mm.
later.
Both
And
altered states of consciousness and these near-death experiences
well,
or
we
past
know,
lives.
right, we know from the literature, near-death experiences, people who have those typically come back changed for the better.
Mm.
And people who remember, who have these extraordinary experiences through out-of-body experiences, that sort of thing, as well as meditation. And so my work was really on, well, how can we intentionally sort of bring this about and not just wait for it to spontaneously happen? And what would that look like? And indeed, through my clinical work, I was finding that it was happening with my patients. So I'm also a clinician, a clinical psychologist, and was using a lot of mindfulness-based therapies with my patients. And I think because they felt comfortable enough, safe enough, they would report some, interesting things that I had not really heard about in the literature.
Can you give us an example?
Well, sure. So working with someone to help them either through meditation or a contemplative-based therapeutic intervention that might have some of that, like dialectical behavior therapy. For instance, I treat a lot of patients with dialectical behavior therapy, and teaching them a meditation, the tenets of it, and practicing it. While I was running a group, people started reporting things like presentience, which is, I thought this was going to happen, and it did. I saw it in my mind's eye, this car crash, and 10 seconds later, it happened right in front of me. Thank goodness I slowed down. Things like that were, again, this was not scientific. I wasn't doing a study. These were people spontaneously reporting these things, more coincidences, synchronicities, presentience. And I began to think about, well, what is that? The science mind wanted to know, what is that? What's happening? Is this someone just more aware, just more in tune because the chaos in their own mind has calmed down? And maybe that is it. Or is this something else? Because it seemed to be really in related in time to learning the meditation or the contemplative practices. So ultimately, I decided what was most important is to ask the question, is this helping them? And it was. It was. They were beginning to trust themselves more. They had a greater sense that they were connected to something bigger. I think the contemplative practices help them sort of gain a little more sense of equanimity, which is really helpful for someone with, some mood liability, So very much like I think many clinicians, I ultimately got back to how does this help human suffering? How does it help the community, our world? And so in that respect, I think I have taken our work at DOPS to a little bit of a different level of really looking at the so what question about all of it. Yeah.
And so there's, sorry to interrupt you.
No, no worries.
There's a very pragmatic way that you're thinking about this for people who are, and consciousness is that are still on the planet.
Yeah.
And it seems as though our field, the mental health fields in medicine, are perfectly fine if you sit cross-legged on a cushion and experience relaxation. But the minute you cross over to say, well, I actually knew that a car crash was coming and therefore averted my involvement in that, that suddenly that we're much more skeptical, or a near-death experience as meaning that consciousness, which we're still struggling to figure out and define and what that is and explain it, survives bodily death and is not simply a representation of something that happens with brain death, release of certain neurochemicals that ease us in that transition, may have evolutionary significance. Those are like two different things, Kim. And what experiences do you have? I can see, of course, in your work with clients that you say, makes perfect sense, and everybody's going to nod and say, yes, do that, but we all know that they really didn't have presentience, that they really didn't leave their body and hover over their dead body and watch the surgeons trying to we all know that. What's been your experience with this as in dealing with the field? And it may be very positive. Maybe all of my statements are just a bias here.
Well, I do think if you speak to, I work in a health system, so university health system, and my physician is, I mean, my husband is a physician. He's an oncologist. He's not my physician. He's just my husband, which is really an important role.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, my wonderful husband, and we have conversations because, of course, he works with cancer patients. I also work in the cancer center, seeing patients here at UVA, and what I have noticed from my colleagues is that they are beginning to accept that there is maybe more than they may understand or know. And quite honestly, they're so thankful and so desiring to help patients. I mean, that's what I see over and over again,
Hmm.
that they are willing even to suspend their own, maybe their own beliefs or judgments and say, well, if it's working, if that's what the patient believes, if that's what helps them, then by all means, let's do this. And I think it has helped that meditation has become more mainstream.
Hmm.
So when I started doing that research over a decade ago, it was still sort of considered fringy. And I think the scientific work that's been done and brought it into the mainstream has really helped people realize, okay, something's going on here. And it's probably a lot of components. It's probably some psychological pieces, some physiological pieces, and maybe something else that I fully believe we don't know everything.
Hmm.
And so to your point, I think in my day-to-day work clinically, many people are more open than you might expect.
Hmm.
I think that that's a little different when you go to journals, when you try to publish, when you move it to that next level, it can be a little more challenging. You know, we all do extremely good, high quality research.
Hmm.
So it's not about our research techniques. It's often the content is just sort of challenging for some editors, some journals to sort of wrap their head around, and that's understandable. I mean,
Hmm.
to be frank, when you're trying to think about a mechanism that nobody really understands or can't maybe even conceive of, it's hard to get someone to buy, okay, we're going to write about this. We
Hmm.
have no idea why it works. We have no idea if the mechanism is even feasible, and yet we're going to publish a work on, so I do get it. I do
Hmm.
get it. And
Hmm.
I keep going back to the pragmatic of, is it helping? We can always look at that.
Right. It's so interesting that the first part of your statement about if you go to the clinical level, as you know, we did a survey where we were asking people in a consumer report style study, had they seen a psychic or a mental health professional? People had seen psychics a fair
Yeah.
bit, and they found them not just a little more helpful, they found them more helpful than professional mental health folks. That's not denigrating the mental
Right.
health folks. It was more about, well, what are they doing, or is it a different population? I also wanted to say that I have not been involved in this area of research or read very much, I think because lots of my own biases that I bring to this. And I was still stuck, I think, at the Raymond Moody stage of this, where these were interesting stories. But listening to your presentations, many of which are available on YouTube, the rigor of your methods was amazing. Careful collection, careful analysis of stories, almost a blinded analysis of these stories,
Mhm.
and very common themes coming up. So you're suggesting a more pragmatic approach. What is it, in addition to teaching perhaps clients to engage in mindfulness, what is it that we need to be asking about for the people that we're working with? Is there some general advice about that?
Oh my gosh. I mean, what I have seen over and over is that people need to be heard. And I work a lot in the medical field with physicians, and I hear over and over again that, they understand that nobody has a lot of time. They understand each person is very specialized and needs to focus on what they're doing. And they still feel like with, the world-class treatment that they're getting, the specialists that they're seeing, that no one is really listening and putting together the whole presentation.
Hmm.
So I do think and worry about that in our current sort of way that we approach medicine. Is we have these amazing, brilliant people who are trained in these very narrow fields, and that's wonderful because for what they do, it's needed. And yet it's rare that we find someone who is working with a patient or a client and looking at all the pieces, the context of their life, what's happened most recently, their belief system. They really don't have a chance to talk about that with anyone.
Hmm.
And many of them don't know what their belief system is. It's actually a lot easier if you can say, tell me about your belief system.
Hmm.
If you say that to most people, they'll be like, what? I'm a Methodist. I don't know. I don't know. So often we pull it out as clinicians by looking at a developmental history, their experiences, the way, we look at the people that raised them
Hmm.
with that understanding that that's going to influence their belief system.
Hmm.
And many of them have never had that
Hmm.
ever,
Hmm.
not even in a friend. So, not even a deep, close friend where that's really hashed out. So to me, it's really about having the time, setting the intention, and having that sort of mindset that I'm going to be with this person and really find out about who they are, what they believe, because that will help direct. It won't give me all the answers. It can
Hmm.
help direct me though,
Hmm.
and mostly let them feel heard.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, and I kept thinking while you were talking about listening to clients and then saying that even the clients or the patients that we're working with, asking them what their belief system is, it's not a question that I would even know what are you aiming at.
Right.
But when we, for example, started talking about psychics and mediums, and oftentimes with highly educated people that I never would have guessed would go see a tarot card or a palm reader person, the stories started to come out of, and not just telling you, oh yeah, I saw the psychic at the carnival, but actually finding deep meaning in that conversation and having received guidance through that conversation. Kind of surprising to me, at least. So consciousness surviving bodily death. I know that you made this comment earlier when we were talking, and if I don't return to it and say, wow, what is your data pointing to, or what are questions on your own mind about that, that the people who are listening to this interview are going to say, gosh, Scott, you missed a big opportunity here. So can you just say a little bit about that?
Well, sure. So in sort of our materialistic approach that has predominated science in this century, the approach is really that we are all biological machines, basically. And no one's really been able to explain how a biological machine produces consciousness. That's sort of the big problem. How does one neuron talking to another one and releasing something generate consciousness, let alone this thing called feelings or emotions or
Right.
thoughts? So our approach is, well, then if that's maybe not answering all our questions or not fitting with what we see in reality, are there alternative ways of looking at this? And what would those look like? And one would be, well, that there's something that exists that is not the body, that we would call consciousness or a soul or something. And you can look at the past and you see this is in all, many of the religious cultures, and this sense that there is something about us that is unique in that way.
Hmm.
And there's some debate. Is it just humans or is it every sentient creature? And that is not a trivial question.
Hmm.
I just read, I think it was New Zealand has passed a law now that sentient creatures, who they are and that they are including mammals and reptiles and things like that, have rights to not be harmed or tortured and that sort of thing, which is really interesting. So,
Hmm.
but I digress. So the idea is looking at, well, what are the alternative explanations if we are thinking materialism doesn't answer all of it, or maybe it falls short of some of these things. And we then go about studying them in whatever way we can. So thinking about, well, how would you explore whether consciousness extends beyond the death of the body? People who experience near death are obvious folks to ask because they've physically died, don't have maybe brain activity, don't have heartbeat, the medical term of death they've achieved, and then they've come back. And so asking them what went on, what do you remember, if anything? And granted, many of them don't remember anything. So we have to recall that it's not like guaranteed you have a near-death experience and you come back with enlightened. Many of them do, however. And so that data we've been able to collect, and you begin to see, oh, there's some sort of indication from this collected data that something's going on, that there's some awareness that they came back with some stories, but all seem to match. That's weird. Okay. So it's things like that that we can begin to research and think about, well, what would that mean? And this is where the philosophers and the theoretical physicists and people come into this to try and develop those theories. So that's way above my pay grade. I'm just a little clinical psychologist.
Can I ask you about that? Is this, you come back from the dead, you have an NDE, and I listened to many of the recordings that the presentations you and your colleagues have done. Is it a universally good experience? What's the balance here? Is it 90-10? Is it 95?
I don't have that number in front of me. Like I said, Dr. Bruce Grayson is the person who really is the expert there. They do happen, though. It is a minority. It's a very significant minority, but I mean significant in that it's a small minority. So, but they do happen.
I'm thinking of a story that was told in one of the presentations, and I hope you'll forgive me that I don't recall which one, and I don't even remember this person's name, but it was of a young child. I think it was from a child that was in Louisiana who had a memory of his plane crashing. He was 3 or 4. And this doesn't seem like a particularly good thing to remember. And it turns out that your research team was able to match up, or the family was able to match up his insistence that he'd crashed in a plane to words he used, including the name of the ship he took off from, the particular battle. It's like, you're listening to this thinking, oh my gosh, I hope I don't come back,
Well, you're talking about the children who remember past lives. Yes.
Yeah.
And so that was a case that Dr. Jim Tucker investigated, and you investigate it just like you would any other claim. He's got very rigorous ways of doing that. And the idea is working with children, that they have no incentive to make this up. So it's often very spontaneous. It often stops. They stop talking about these things as they get older. So you get them when they're young. They're usually noticed by the parents because of these strange things, maybe nightmares or things. And the premise is perhaps this is whatever that consciousness was come back in another body, and for whatever reason, remembering the past. And here again, this would be some evidence that that whatever we are, that makes us the consciousness or our soul, is not just gone when our body dies. And so Dr. Tucker and Ian Stevenson before him have studied this. And the way you look at it scientifically is you collect this data from people who, again, have no reason to make this up, who are too young to have gone and Googled it all and, developed a portfolio that they can memorize. And then you take the data and you go back and search for where is the evidence from this. And in multiple cases, quite stunning in many cases, he's been able to go back and find evidence of, in that case, it was evidence that this person, this child, remembered a life, was able to give details, very specific, very accurate, that matched up a person who actually did die in a plane crash. And so that's another way of pulling in evidence here.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So, Kim, if a clinician listening to this really wanted to explore further. Is there something that you could recommend for getting started? A good read. They don't have to be convinced that this is an area important, but more to take them a step further, ideas about how to utilize this, et cetera, about the research and the thinking that you're doing?
I think going to the DOPS webpage may be a start. There's a lot of information there. I will be honest, it's not particularly clinician oriented. So it is going to be much more on the research side. For myself, I really feel like I bridge two areas. I am a clinical psychologist, a scientist, and very involved in my mainstream psychology, and also doing this research. And I don't feel that they are incompatible. So I wrote a book with my daughter who is studying psychology also, and she is a meditation teacher and a yoga instructor.
How come that doesn't surprise me?
And she and I over the pandemic wrote a book that's been published by Taylor and Francis, and it's called Mindfulness Across the Lifespan: An Intergenerational Guide.
Wow.
And what I love about that is it has some mainstream psychology pieces, and then it has other things, bringing in, well, there's also this, and when you have patients or clients with this, how can you work on that? And we covered 12 chapters where it is meant to span the lifespan. And these were really the things that we found ourselves working with patients and clients over and over and over again. And we thought, well, why don't we just put it in a book
Fantastic.
and compile this? So because people kept asking, do you have a book? Do you have something I can take with me and read? And so it's got some of the information. It's all very scientifically based, and yet it includes these other things. And it has exercises. It has, meditations and
Wow.
yoga poses, and going from early on, like the first chapter is more about self-esteem, self-concept, and then all the way to chapter 12, which is about death and dying. And I work a lot with people with fear of death and dying. And so in that chapter, it's called So Long for Now, ?
Oh.
We talk about the fear of death and dying dissipating when someone has a near-death experience. And there's some research that even when you read about these things, as you expand your mind to these possibilities, it actually helps reduce some of that fear. And we talk about terror management theory, which some psychologists know about, some don't. That was developed in social psychology, really looking at why would we have this fear of death and dying, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're sentient creatures with this consciousness that can predict that we will die, and yet that's very, very disturbing to us. And so the terror management theory says basically, there's sort of two ways to approach this. One is denial, which maybe works short term, and some way of accommodating this into your worldview, making sense of it, which often is going to be, in our culture, a religious or spiritual accommodation, some way of meaning making. And we talk about that in that last chapter, because that's also, part of the lifespan that we as clinicians may encounter.
Wow. That sounds wonderful. Mindfulness across the lifespan.
Yes.
Perfect. Kim, thanks so much for spending all this time with me. I know you're very busy, and I'm deeply grateful that you would talk to me about the important research that you're doing.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I would just encourage anyone out there to be open, know that there are other people doing this work. I'm happy to have folks reach out to me with their stories, their interest. I'm always looking for collaborators, and I'm always looking for a good challenge. I certainly don't have all the answers, and I'm okay if I never find all the answers. I think that's another important piece. I'm okay with just sort of exploring and understanding, well, what really helps people, and can we at least do that?
Perfect. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you.